Today, we're digging into a really chilling case from the Thai Supreme Court archives. It's got everything: a grieving husband, a mysterious roadside attack, and a whole series of what look like coincidences. But as we're about to see, it really makes you ask a huge question about justice. When all you have are little puzzle pieces, how do you actually prove a murder beyond a reasonable doubt? Let's get into it. And that's really the heart of the matter, isn't it? This was the massive challenge for prosecutors. They didn't have any of the usual stuff you see in movies. No eyewitness, no confession, certainly no smoking gun. They had to build their entire case on what we call circumstantial evidence. You know, all those small, seemingly tiny details left behind. It's a fascinating look at how justice can still work. All right, so our story begins on this dark rural road in Thailand, back on a February night in 1987. But before we get into the mystery and the contradictions, let's just lay out the things that are not in dispute. The cold, hard facts that everyone, from the first cops on the scene to the Supreme Court judges, completely agrees on. So here's the grim reality of that night. The body of Mrs. Chongjit Tayukhen is found on a pretty desolate road. Cause of death? 2 shotgun blasts, fired at close range. And the single most important fact: the only person with her when she died was her husband, Mr. Seksak. With nobody else to talk to, the police had only one place to start: the sole survivor. And Mr. Seksak, he gave them a very detailed, very dramatic account of what he claimed was just a random, brutal attack. So, this is the story Mr. Seksak tells the police. He says he pulls over, a motorcycle suddenly appears out of nowhere, these 2 guys call his name, but then shoot his wife. He even says that with her last breath, she tells him to run. He escapes, hides, and then goes for help. It's this harrowing tale, right? But as investigators started to actually look at the crime scene, they found that the physical evidence, well, it was telling a very, very different story. Okay, so let's get into how this whole story started to fall apart. Because when police really began to examine the crime scene, his version of events just didn't line up with what they were seeing. And right away, here's the first huge red flag. Mr. Seksak was absolutely clear. His wife was shot while she was sitting in the passenger seat. But that's not where police found her. Her body was on the road next to the car, and both car doors were shut. So you have to ask, how did she get from inside the car to outside on the road after being shot? And then there's the car itself. Look, a close-range shotgun blast is messy. It's incredibly destructive. If his wife had really been shot inside that car like he claimed, the interior would have been completely torn up. But when they looked, nothing. The car was pristine. No bullet holes, no damage, no stray pellets. Nothing. The ground that night was soft, it was damp, basically perfect for leaving footprints. So police searched the spot where he said he was standing, just a few feet behind the car, and they searched the area by the pond where he said he hid. And they found absolutely nothing. No footprints. It was as if he was never there. And this is where the husband's emotional story slams right into a wall of cold, hard science. A key part of his story is his wife's heroic last words, but the medical examiner's report was completely definitive. The wounds to her head and heart would have caused instantaneous death. It was physiologically impossible for her to have said anything at all. So, with the husband's story just full of holes, investigators shifted their focus. They turned from the crime scene to the man himself, and they brought in forensic science to see what it had to say. So let's talk about something called gunshot residue, or GSR. When you fire a gun, this invisible cloud of tiny microscopic particles just explodes from the weapon, and it coats the hands and clothes of the person who pulled the trigger. The key ingredients they look for are antimony and barium. Think of it like a chemical fingerprint that screams, "I just fired a gun." And the timing here is absolutely crucial. See, this residue is fragile. You can wash it off, you can wipe it away pretty easily. But the police were fast. They got the GSR test done on Mr. Seksak's hands just 1 hour after the murder was reported. And, well, what do you know? The results were conclusive. The lab found those telltale elements, antimony and barium, all over Mr. Seksak's hands. Scientifically speaking, this meant his hands had been very, very close to a gun when it was fired, and it happened very recently. But this is what he told the police. He insisted he hadn't fired a gun in 2 years. So now, the court is looking at 2 totally conflicting stories. You've got the husband's word on one side, and on the other, you have the story those little microscopic particles on his hands were telling. The case was no longer just about what happened at the crime scene. Prosecutors started weaving all these threads together to create a much more complete picture. They were looking for inconsistencies, a logical narrative, and that all-important question, why? What was the motive? And it turns out there was. The court heard testimony from the victim's own mother, her siblings, her friends, and they all painted a picture of a really troubled marriage. Mr. Seksak was having an affair, and just a month before the murder, his wife had actually forced him to sign a written promise with a witness present, swearing that he would end it. So the court is just looking at this story, and none of it adds up. I mean, if you're standing just a few feet away, how can you not describe the men who just killed your wife? Why didn't he seem to care about catching them? And the biggest one of all, if the assassins knew him by name and he was the target, why on earth would they shoot his wife and just let him run away? His story just didn't make any sense. So how does this all come together in the end? The court was now facing this mountain of indirect evidence. There wasn't one single aha moment that proved his guilt, but the sheer weight of all these little things was becoming overwhelming. And this is really the core idea of a circumstantial case. You know, by itself, the body's location could just be a weird fluke. The lack of footprints, an anomaly. The gunshot residue, maybe contamination. But when you put it all together, the body, the clean car, the missing footprints, the impossible last words, the GSR, the motive, and the completely illogical story, well, the coincidences stop looking like coincidences. They start looking like a pattern of deception. And the courts agreed. The first court found him guilty, sentenced him to over 33 years in prison. He appealed, of course, but the Court of Appeals looked at the evidence and said, nope, the conviction stands. So he took it all the way to the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court, which also confirmed the verdict. Final judgment. And this is the key line right from the Supreme Court's final ruling. They didn't just say there was some evidence. They ruled that this web of circumstantial evidence was, and I quote, strong enough to conclude that he was the killer. There was no other reasonable explanation. Ultimately, it all boiled down to this. The only thing pointing to his innocence was his own story. And piece by piece, all the evidence had shown that his story was, in the court's official judgment, suspicious and unbelievable. So we're left with this really fundamental question. This case is just a powerful reminder that sometimes the truth isn't found in a single dramatic confession. It's found in the patient, careful collection of a bunch of seemingly small facts. It really challenges us to think about what proof actually is, and to ask ourselves, at what point does a collection of coincidences become a certainty?